There are some things that modern people do wrong, but overall, we're not as creepy as people did in the past. Some people still don't bother to wash their hands after using the bathroom, and it's clear that a lot of people send inappropriate photos of body parts to strangers. But at least we all know that these behaviors are not normal, and as responsible citizens, we try to call out the worst offenders. 1,000 years ago, though, people did a lot of really creepy things that they thought were just another day at the rodent-infested hovel, the castle, or whatever drafty, nasty building they lived or worked in. Part of the reason for this was that people didn't really understand anything, and another reason was that they were just making things up because that's how they felt they could control their not very controllable lives on Earth. Here are some of the scariest things that people thought were normal about 1,000 years ago. So sit down and pour yourself a drink of poo water. Who done it? Why not just ask the corpse? Any 4-year-old will tell you that dead bodies can't figure out who killed them. If you ask a current forensic scientist, they'll probably say, kind of, because clues found on a body often lead to a suspect. But that's not the same thing as bodies solving their own murder. Anyway, people did think that dead bodies could talk, at least 1,000 years ago. National Geographic calls this cruentation. And it's what people did because they didn't know about DNA and weren't good at things like gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, or caring if they found the real criminal or not. It wasn't as important to make sure you were killing the right person as it was to kill someone. People back then thought that dead people were only mostly dead, which means Miracle Max wasn't really a novel thinker. In the past, people who looked into crimes thought that putting a dead body near its killer would make it bleed. This makes for very interesting forensics, but bodies don't really bleed much after they've died, so this method probably didn't lead to a guilty decision very often, but that didn't matter. They could always throw the suspect into a pool instead, since people who float are obviously more guilty than people who sink. Murder by institution. We like to think that most people who sacrifice people did so a very long time ago, before people started to realize that maybe the gods don't like blood and cut heads that much. But almost 1,000 years ago, people all over the world, including the Toltecs in South America and the Vikings, were still sacrificing children. What the Museum of Denmark says is that the Viking blot killings happened all the time until around 1000 AD, when Christianity began to spread. Vikings would kill people in trade for goods. For example, you could have a blot sacrifice if you needed good weather for your crops, wanted to do well in a raid, or saw that the ratings for your History Channel show were going down. India had its own human sacrifice practice, which was popular from about 550 CE through the 18th century. Called sati, it was the expectation that if a widowed woman did not have any surviving children, she should just throw herself onto her husband's funeral pyre and burn to death, so as not to become a burden to anyone. In the early years of this horrific practice, sati was something a woman did willingly, but at its peak it was a requirement. Don't want to burn to death with your husband's corpse? Too bad. Here's a match. Sati was eventually outlawed, though occasionally there are reports of it happening even today. Triple bypass and haircut at the same time. 1,000 years ago, people didn't really do triple bypasses, but if they needed surgery, they went to a barber, not a doctor. To be honest, because scissors. For some reason, people thought that someone who was good at cutting hair would also be good at cutting skin. The book Ancient Origins says that doctors were only for the wealthy. To be honest, this is kind of how things are going in the US right now, but whatever. A real doctor was way too smart to touch blood or, God forbid, a dirty peasant's broken limbs. So he would go see sick, rich people and tell them, yes, you're sick. You should swallow a bottle of mercury. Now please give me money. People who aren't important would be taken care of by the barber-surgeon. He had to set broken bones, lance-infected wounds, treat accidents, and if he was good enough, cut people off at the limbs. Also, give them a nice pompadour. The scariest thing about it all is that doctors went to college and got their degree, but they didn't really do anything but give advice. The people who did the dangerous, hands-on work learned everything they knew on the job. Medicine today may have some issues, but damn. Pee for everything. These days, we really think that peeing in a toilet is the right thing to do. Or, if you're a guy and someone else is in the bathroom, stand off the back deck. But people thought pee was good for things 1,000 years ago. From what the Smithsonian says, this goes back at least to Roman times, when people would use urine to wash their clothes. It's a good thing if your cat pees in your clean clothes because it makes them cleaner. People really thought that peeing was so important for keeping clothes clean that towns would put barrels out on the street for people to use. The pee would then be collected and taken to the public laundry to be used. Urine contains ammonia, which is still frequently used as a cleaner, so this is obviously gross, but not as crazy as you might think. People liked to use pee for cleaning even after soap was invented, because the ammonia was better at getting rid of tough stains. It was also great at making dye stick to fabric, which is why the textile business couldn't do without it. People were still collecting pee as late as the 16th century, so that it could be used as a mordant, or treatment that cloth makers could use on fabric to make sure the color would last. Smithsonian doesn't say how they got rid of the smell in the end, which is a shame, because cat pee lasts a long time. Losing hair and teeth, but face is young and pasty. Queen Elizabeth I made the almost dead look more famous, but she didn't come up with it. Lead-based makeup was popular from ancient Egypt until the 18th century, when people finally realized that their makeup turned their skin a weird color and probably caused their hair and teeth to fall out. This is why they looked so bad in old age. National Geographic says that rich women liked lead makeup because they thought that being pasty white made them look young. Because really, who doesn't want to look like a sick kid who grew up in a basement? Anyway, the lead-based makeup Elizabeth wore was pretty much the same as what Roman women wore. Egyptians used lead-based powders for eyeliner before that. You can see this in pictures of pharaohs and other important people from the past. Strangely, Egyptian eye makeup did keep eye problems away, which was cool because most Egyptians didn't live past their 30s, so they didn't have time to get eye cancer or any of the other terrible diseases that might have come from getting lead in your eyes for a long time. Even though the height of lead-based makeup was about 500 years ago, no one in the 11th century would have thought it was particularly weird, since the practice had been around for a very long time.
Sorry, I'm a little short this month, here's an eel. Bartering isn't really a thing anymore. While it would be cool if you could, you can't just pick apples from your garden tree and take them to the Apple store to trade them in for an iPad. You might be able to do that with your friends, but over 1,000 years ago, not everyone had money. If you needed food or goods, you had to find other things that you could use as money, like eels, you know? That's right. Time magazine says that people in England did use eels as money. In fact, by the Middle Ages, there were clear rules for how to count eels. 25 eels were called a stick, and 10 sticks were called a bind. That is, an Apple iPad could be worth around 10 ties and 2 sticks, or even more. Eggs have been important to England's economy since the 8th century. They are even mentioned a lot in record books from the 11th century, which make it seem like people paid their rent with eggs more often than coins. So why eels? In those days, churches owned a lot of land, and the monks would never go hungry because they would pay rent in eels. Also, eels were often served at the king's feasts, so the elite needed a lot of them all the time. Would you like a glass of poo water? In a common movie trope, people in Britain around 1,000 years ago throw buckets of poop into the street, generally from at least the second floor, so everyone can laugh at the poor guy who was walking by at just the right time. Luckily, this is just a myth. According to Slate, there isn't much proof that people did this. Living 1,000 years ago doesn't mean you couldn't understand that poop is gross and no one wants to step in it, especially if it belongs to someone else. But that doesn't mean that people who lived 1,000 years ago knew much about how poop can spread terrible diseases, especially if it gets into a big body of water like the Thames. In Europe 1,000 years ago, people who lived in cities did have to get rid of their waste. Like many people today, they believed in the questionable philosophy of out of sight, out of mind, which meant they were fine with throwing all of their waste into a nearby river, where it would be washed downstream and become someone else's problem, at least in theory. Everyone was doing it, so it became everyone's problem in the end. But it took a very long time for people to figure out that the Thames might not be the best place to dump raw sewage.
Can't we just cuddle instead? Smart people from long ago knew where kids come from, but they didn't know how to do snoo-snoo without getting in trouble. And let's be honest, people have always wanted to snoo without any consequences. It's too bad that most of the things people tried to do 1,000 years ago to avoid getting pregnant were either really gross or just plain gross. This one isn't terrible, but it's still very bad advice. As early as the 2nd century, people used a lemon as a neck cap. This practice was still going strong during the time of the famous swing singer Casanova. Ancient Egyptian women would also put a paste made of crocodile poop and honey in their behinds, but we're not going to talk about that because it happened a long time ago and we don't want to. There were also condoms, which sound pretty normal next to crocodile poop. However, Bustle says they were made from animal guts because rubber and latex weren't real things back then. Plus, animal gut condoms could be used again and again, which isn't gross at all. Not interested in any of these? Don't worry. You could also drink a liquid with lead in it, which would probably work pretty well at making you unable to have children. Graveyards weren't just for visiting deceased loved ones. People from a long time ago aren't thought to have been very, romantically bold. They were polite and gentlemanly, and everything they did in the bedroom was legal and allowed by the church. Kinkiness has been around for a very long time. As long as there have been eels to pay the bill, there have been ladies of the evening ready to fulfill their customers' strange fantasies. And one of those strange fantasies was so popular that it lived on for hundreds of years. According to ancient origins, sex workers who hung out in graves usually made a lot of money. But why? In the Middle Ages, graves were like party central. People from the town would set up graveyard markets, and if you wanted to drink and gamble, you could sit on a loved one's grave with a beer and a game of dice and no one would think that was strange. So, even before that, prostitutes learned that they could make money in graves in 2 ways. During the day, they could work as mourners for hire, and at night, they could do other things. They sold to people who dug graves, were widowers, or had weird fetish with graveyard. This wasn't just a passing trend, it lasted for hundreds of years. Surgery sucked. These days, it's hard to imagine having surgery without drugs. Not only would it be miserable for the person being operated on, but it would also be miserable for the surgeon who would have to carefully move around organs and blood vessels while the patient was squirming like a snake that had just been beheaded. Being able to put someone in a pain-free state of unconsciousness did not lead to the need for surgery. Some people knew they needed surgery a very long time ago, long before anyone even thought it might be possible to make surgery painless. So if you were sick enough to need surgery, you could either die of whatever was wrong with you or have surgery while you were fully awake and aware. The University of Medicine and Health Sciences says that the Greeks, Chinese, and other very ancient people did have a basic form of anesthesia. But until the early 1300s, when surgeons began to try things like opium and mandrake to treat pain, there were not many reports of real attempts to do so in Europe. Before that, if you had to have surgery or, God forbid, your arm sawed off, you would find a bottle of whiskey and a piece of wood to bite on. Then you would hope that the pain would knock you out before it got really bad. Putting a sculpture of yourself as a corpse on your tomb. It happened about 700 years ago instead of 1,000 years ago, so this is more of a treat. It's just weird enough that we can't leave it out. Atlas Obscura says that during the Black Plague, rich people would have their bodies buried in 2-story tombs. On top was a lifelike sculpture of the person who had died, and on the bottom was a sculpture of the person who had died as they probably looked right now, as a horrible body coming apart. Today, we don't like to think about what happens to bodies after they've been buried for a while. At least, not the bodies of people we know. But we do like to think about what happens to the bodies of horror movie characters. That's why the strange but still common practice of embalming exists. Back then, putting your body in a cadaver tomb was a nod to the Grim Reaper and a recognition that we all die and turn into dust. Or maybe it was just a chance for people to see what they'd look like as a zombie from The Walking Dead. If you were already dead, your family and friends wouldn't do this for you. That's why cadaver tombs were usually built while the person was still living, so you could look at your own rotting face and give the sculptor the thumbs up.